Chapter 15. As soon as the cabin door closed behind Sam, Pat asked Ezra, "What was that meaning about you two being up in a cottonwood tree tonight and hearing things?" Ezra swiftly told Pat the story of their arrival in Santa Alicia, the strange reaction that followed their asking the way of to Mose Higgins' ranch, and their encounter with Clarence Adams in the dance hall. Pat interrupted him at this point in his narrative. "You mean to say that Adams was just sitting around there doing nothing, instead of out hunting a kidnapped girl or Mose Higgins, murderer?" "Well, that's just what I mean," growled Ezra. "Not near as we found out in town, he hadn't made no report about what happened at Higgins' ranch tonight. Nobody said nothing about the gal being kidnapped nor the old man being dead." Pat shook his head disbelievingly. "Well, hell of a way for a deputy to act, particularly when he claims to be in love with the girl. Hell, I thought he'd be breaking his neck getting into town and organizing posses to come after us." "Oh, you don't know the half of her yet," Ezra told him. He come on to explain how Adams had gone out and come back with the scarred-faced man who packed 2 guns and threw down on Sam without any explanation, about the ruckus in the dance hall and their escape through the back door, and the perch in the cottonwoods where they overheard the significant conversation between Jeff Cadre and Clarence, repeating it word for word as he recalled it. Pat put in, "Well, I'll be damned plugged," when Ezra finished. "So Clarence is in with the gang, huh? No wonder I didn't trust him when I first saw him. And no wonder he wanted to carry me off to jail by himself so he could finish me off on the road, pretending I tried to escape. He must have knowed Mose was looking for me. Must have guessed that I was the one. And he probably knew all along that who it was that killed Mose and brought him here." "I reckon. And I don't see why Sam let him sneak out of here just now. It seems to me like we ought to be tying him up there with the rest of the outlaws." Ezra turned his one eye disapprovingly at Harry and the other members of the gang inside the cabin. "Oh, I'm certain Sam has his reasons. As long as Clarence doesn't suspect we know the truth about him, he may lead Sam to something important." "What are we going to do while Sam's out there having fun?" Ezra demanded. "Sit on our rumps twiddling our thumbs?" "No," Pat decreed. "I think we best try to get into town and get a hold of Sheriff Petrillo. From what happened tonight, I'm going to guess he's honest." "Yeah, and Clarence has got him thinking Sam and me are in with Lacy," Ezra reminded him. "We'll get arrested for sure as soon as we show our noses there in Santa Alicia." "I guess we'll have to risk that. I think we can make an honest sheriff believe me if I can get a chance to talk to him. Besides," Pat went on with a wan smile, "I don't want to be the complaining sort, but I kind of reckon a doctor wouldn't do me no harm. Not that I care whether I bleed to death," he went on hastily, "but you boys might need some help cleaning out the rest of the gang, and I ain't going to be much good to you if I'm dead." Ezra leapt to his feet immediately with an exclamation of rough solitude. "I'd forgotten that you done gone soft, so a few bullet holes might wreck your delicate constitution. Here, let me take a look at them bandages." Pat waved him away and pulled his jacket tight about his torso. "I don't need your kind of doctoring. I'll make out till the sawbones can patch me up correct. How many live ones have we got to take in?" he ended with a glance at Harry and his companion. "I don't rightly know. There's 4 more outside, some dead, and some of 'em are only part dead, but hell, why take any of 'em in?" Ezra exploded. "Let me knock 'em on the head and we'll stack 'em on up outside the door there. We know every one of 'em is ripe for hanging." "No," Pat demurred sharply. It's up to us to see that those who are alive get a fair trial." He paused and then explained simply. "I wouldn't be here right now if Helen Higgins hadn't insisted I go to jail for her trial. Clarence had the same idea about me that you're having about those fellers. You go outside and see how many of them are fit for jail fodder." Grumbling under his breath at the uselessness of it, Ezra went out and examined the 4 bound men outside. 2 of them were still breathing, though unconscious. The bodies of the other 2 had gone cold. When he came back to report, Pat said, "Saddle up 4 horses from out of the corral, and we'll pack them to the sheriff in San Alicia, and also throw a rig on a horse for me, if Sam rode his away." "Sam must have followed the deputy on foot," Ezra told him. "His horse is standing out here." He went out again and slammed the door shut to indicate his ill humor, walked to the corral and began roping out the first horses that came under his loop. Pat was turning soft, all right. There'd been a time not long ago when Pat would have agreed with it that it was silly to go through so much trouble to deliver a batch of live outlaws to the sheriff, but the West was getting civilized, by God, and it grieved Ezra to see Pat getting civilized too. Coddling outlaws and carrying them into town instead of rapping them over the head and leaving them to lay. What a hell of a note. While Ezra was brooding over the unfairness of it, he swiftly roped out 4 horses and girthed some saddles on. He led them to the cabin and roughly tossed the 2 live outlaws across the saddles and tussled them up securely, and then walked inside to get the other 2. Pat grinned at the black look of disgust on Ezra's face. He knew it was just a poise that Ezra was on, and that the big one-eyed man wasn't half as ruthless as he was pretending to be. He looked on in silence, while Ezra dragged Harry and the other outlaw out by their heels, and then got up and dragged his weak body outside. Daylight showed in the sky above the high walls of the canyon, though it was still black night in the bottom. Pat painfully crawled into Sam's saddle, while Ezra profanely finished the job of tying each helpless outlaw across his saddle, and in a short time the procession moved down the canyon with Pat in the front, leading 2 burdened horses, and Ezra bringing up the rear with the other 2. Pat let Sam's weary horse amble along at a slow gait, which gave the minimum of discomfort to his wounded body. He was feeling very little pain now. He felt numb, almost incapable of feeling pain, and curiously lightheaded. There was a lot of things he didn't understand, but he was lethargically disinclined to bother his tired brain with any questions at the moment. He felt sure that everything would be cleared up when they reached San Alicia and turned their prisoners over to the sheriff. The backbone of the outlaw gang would be broken up by the death and capture of these 6 men, and they had the deadwood on Adams and Jeff Cadre too. That would be about all the men Lacy would need for his plan. That's what Pat surmised. He tried to wonder about Mose Higgins, to feel sorry that the old man was dead, but it was difficult for him to work up any great curiosity or pity in that direction. He hadn't actually known Mose. That was only the old obligation, and he had done his best to repay it. Too bad he hadn't arrived sooner, but that was the way things went. Helen Higgins was the one who mattered now. Some of the coldness went out of Pat's body as he thought of the courageous girl who had ridden back to face the outlaw gang alone while he lay helpless in the trail. She was 1 in a million, all right. He was mighty glad Clarence Adams had showed up his true colors. It had worried him all along to think that Helen could be in love with the deputy. He got to chuckling as he rode along and thought what Sally would say if he rode back to the Lazy Mare Ranch with Helen Higgins and told Sally that she was the little girl Moses had wanted him to look after. Still in all, maybe it wasn't so funny. Maybe that's just what he'd have to do. His obligation to Mose remained. It was stronger now that Mose was dead. What would become of the orphan girl? She couldn't be very happy around San Alicia with suspicion running high that her daddy was mixed up somehow with the Lacy gang. He thought to himself that Sally would understand and would welcome the girl, but in his own heart he knew that what he really feared was Helen's reaction if he gave her such an invitation. That had been a damn close shave out there by the corral tonight, and he knew damn well that he could have kissed the girl, and he had wanted to kiss her at that moment, and that's what scared Pat Stevens. It wasn't right for a man who loved his wife to find himself wanting to kiss a strange girl. In his own heart, he knew it didn't have anything to do with his love for Sally, but it scared him just the same. Suppose he discovered after he got Helen home to Powder Valley that he still wished to kiss her. What then? He wiggled uneasily in the saddle and tried to change his train of thoughts. They were nearing the foot of the canyon now, where the walls were widening out and letting daylight into the trail. He turned his head to look at the two outlaw horses behind him, carrying their unconscious burdens, with the bulky figure of Ezra erect in the saddle behind him. The warmness inside him spread out when Ezra saw him looking back and lifted a cheery hand in greeting. By God, Pat couldn't help thinking this had been a good night, just like the old times, with the three of them working together as they'd done so often in the past. He realized that he had been a fool to come off from Powder Valley without Sam and Ezra. He might have known that they would sense the sort of mission he was riding on and would follow him. Well, it was lucky for him they had, he mused. It would have been a certain end of one Pat Stevens in that Lonesome Creek trail if they hadn't come along when they did. And he knew now that he had actually expected them. Though he had refused to admit it to himself, there hadn't been any doubt in his mind that they'd be there back in his play as long as they needed to be. He checked his horse for Ezra to come up beside him when he reached the point where the mountain canyon widened out into the flat reaches of the New Mexico desert. The sun had not yet crawled above the flat horizon eastward, but the sky was painted with red flame, and the rolling dunes of desert sand took on robes of shifting color in the morning haze. "It ain't far to San Alicia in jail now," Ezra informed him with a wide grin when he reached his side. "It was right here where Sam and me hit the canyon riding from town." Pat nodded and put his horse into a trot. He felt curiously wide awake and light-headed. There was a driving force inside him that bade him hurry and get the job done. One of those old Stephen hunches that had stood with him in good stead before. The tired horses responded to the challenge of the new day also. They pricked their ears and lengthened their stride as they headed towards town, as though remembering the comfortable stalls and feed bins at the hotel livery stable from which they had been jerked away by their owners. The outlines of the little town of San Alicia assumed unsubstantial form in front of them on the flat plain, like an elusive mirage with which the desert often tantalized his men. It was wreath-like, seeming to hover above the surface of the ground, like a tiny doll house without actual shape or form. Then the red rim of the sun was showing up over the horizon like a giant hand, and there was real San Alicia waiting for them. A bleak and treeless collection of adobe houses squatted forlorn in the middle of nothingness, and they were upon it almost before they realized they had covered much distance. A few householders came to their doors and stared out at them with apathetic disinterest as they rode through the outskirts, but when they approached the village square, they discovered many saddled horses and a group of hard-eyed men gathered in front of an old building with a high steeple which marked as the local courthouse. "You reckon we better try to duck around and find out what's what?" Ezra asked Pat nervously. "Don't be forgetting they got me and Sam marked out as a couple outlaws, and we ain't exactly anxious to be treated as such." "We'll just ride right up and put our cards on the table," Pat decreed. "Things have gone too far now for anything to be gained by holding back. It's time for a showdown, and I gotta get myself to a doctor," he ended candidly. Ezra shot a worried glance at him and saw that Pat's face was ashen in the morning light. He offered no more remonstrations, but rode on at Pat's side. Big-headed and six-gun men turned to observe them curiously as they approached. An excited murmur swept over the armed group when they came close enough for the men to see what the lead pack horses carried roped upon their saddles. Sheriff Petrillo appeared on the threshold of the courthouse as Pat and Ezra pulled up in front. The men parted on either side of the steps to let him come down. The sheriff's dark features were gaunt with weariness, and his red-rimmed eyes showed the strain of a sleepless night. His eye lit upon Ezra's huge bulk and single good eye. He came down the steps slowly with both hands rested lightly upon the butts of his gun. He spoke in his native tongue to some of the men on each side of the stairs, and they fell in beside him, with their hands on their guns as well. Ezra swung off his horse and walked towards to meet the sheriff. He carefully kept his hands away from his gun. "I know what you're thinking," he greeted the sheriff, "but you've made a bad mistake. I ain't one of the Lacy gang, no matter what you heard." "No?" asked the sheriff in his grave, mellow voice. "No," said Ezra strongly. "This feller back here will vouch for me. I reckon you've heard of Pat Stevens from Powder Valley?" "Pat Stevens? But yeah. Who hasn't?" asked the sheriff politely. "Which of those with you is Pat Stevens?" "I'll let him talk for himself." Ezra turned with a sweeping gesture, his big hand wavering, and then dropped to his side, his mouth gaping. For Pat had fallen into the dust where his horse had stopped. He lay there unmoved and lax. Ezra shuddered and started forward, exclaiming, "Some of you, give me a hand. He's hurt bad and needs a doctor." "Not so fast, amigo," Sheriff Petrillo warned him from behind. "I'll take your gun and then we will discuss this matter." A tall figure detached itself from the others, and Ezra caught a brief glimpse of a caustic smile twitch across the scarred face of the man that he knew as Jeff Cadry. "Don't be letting one-eyed fool you, Sheriff," Cadry warned him. "I know Pat Stevens good, and I'm saying that man on the ground don't look no more like Stevens than I do." End of chapter 15.